And Carl Purcell, for whatever reason, didn't want to leave his homestead in Plymouth. If he just moved across the county line, he would have been in Congress for a lot more time. But he chose to retire rather than run for election. So at the state legislative level, we had a 3-judge panel put together by the state Supreme Court. And they named T. John Lazinski, the retired chief judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals, former lieutenant governor under George Romney, as a Democrat under George Romney. And and then there was a circuit court judge, who's kind of on and off. That we had one guy from Crawford County, another guy from another Grayling or something, and then Harold Hood, an active Court of Appeals judge from Detroit. And so those three basically adopted a plan using the APOL standards from 10 years before. And
it was designed by a Department of Management and Budget bureaucrat named Eric Swanson.
Yeah.
Who was a completely unpolitical figure. He came up with the lines using the APOL standards, gave them to the 3-judge panel with Lazinski as chair, and they said fine, right?
Pretty much. T. John, I think, tweaked it a little bit, but not too much.
So all told, the Republicans did better than they had under Hatcher Kleiner and Austin Kleiner back in 64 and 72.
And in fact, in 1992, one of the great surprises of my life was that on election night, I got all these reports that, you know what, the Republicans might actually control the State House of Representatives. As it turned out, after recounts and canvasses and certification, it ended up 55-55, and we had for that 2-year period the era of shared power.
Shared power.
And each month the speakership would trade off. When Paul Hilligans was the speaker, then the Democrats controlled the committees. When Curtis Hertel was the speaker, the next month the Republicans would control the chairmanship of all of the committees. And it was, during that time period that we had a window of opportunity occur because the voters in 1992, in addition to electing the State House of Representatives and having a presidential election and things like that, one of the ballot question proposals in 1992 was term limitation. And term limitation changed the institution of the state legislature, and it also, with a 55-55 tie in the House, it caused a couple of state representatives to say, you know what, the clock is running and I'm going to be out of a job come 1998, and I might want to run for maybe mayor of Lansing or mayor of Pontiac. And that's what David Hollister did, and that's what Charlie Harrison did. And when they were elected in November of 93 and resigned from the state legislature, then all of a sudden the Republicans had 55 seats and the Democrats only 93. And then when special elections were called, in that interim time period, that's when I advocated that we make some changes to the Michigan campaign finance law. And
what were those 3 things that you did?
Well,
union dues.
The first thing the legislature went after was to impose some penalties on illegal teacher strikes, and then after that was completed, then the next was I had argued that what we needed was we needed to extend the ban on corporate contributions and expenditures to labor unions. And in addition, that we should require then these labor unions to establish separate segregated funds of their own, and and require that any kind of PAC payroll deduction have annual affirmative consent. And then we were going to treat all the PACs that were formed by, let's say, the Teamsters of the UAW as one for contribution limitation purposes. So no longer could they go out and establish 10 UAW PACs, each with a $10,000 contribution limit. Now they could have one PAC and only one for contribution limitation purposes.
How about political bingo? Wasn't that in
Well, that was in a different law. This was to
Right.
amend the.
But it was part of this window of opportunity.
The Charitable Gaming Act was amended, and it basically said that any kind of political committee under the Michigan Campaign Finance Law was not a qualified organization, and was therefore ineligible to get a bingo license or to get a millionaire party license or a raffle license. And that also was enacted, I call that 7 days in April. Like 7 days in May and 7 days in April.
Yeah.
We got the go-ahead to do this as soon as the voters approved Proposal A in March of 1994. And then in that little brief time period, these three significant pieces of legislation were enacted.
Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce and Citizens United were starting in 1985. You and Richard McClellan, tell us about it.
Well, first, I decided to go to law school in 1980. And so when I got done with law school, I had a lot of time on my hands. And so one of the things I thought about was what would be a lawsuit that the Michigan Chamber of Commerce could bring that would have impact, perhaps maybe even go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1985, I was reading, some newsletter about a U.S. Supreme Court decision that had come down earlier in the year. It was called NICPAC versus FEC. And there, the court, I think a 7-2 vote, upheld declared unconstitutional the restriction on independent expenditures by political action committees. And so I was thinking, what's the next lawsuit to come out of, the Federal Election Campaign Act that deals with independent expenditures? And it seemed to me that if the court had found that restrictions on individuals and now political action committees were unconstitutional as a violation of the First Amendment, and then a few years earlier in Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston, that restrictions on corporations getting involved in ballot question campaigns was unconstitutional, that maybe this was the next one. And I had looked at some dissents from a case called U.S. versus UAW in 1957, and there Hugo Black and Chief Justice Earl Warren basically dissented in that case, and they basically said that we can't have any restrictions on speech that would affect either labor unions or corporations. And as I looked at that dissent, I said, a lot of these things found their way into Buckley versus Vallejo and then later First National Bank of Boston. About this time, Vern Ehlers had been elected to the state Senate in a special election to fill a vacancy that was caused, and so
He was a Republican from Grand Rapids.
That's correct. And he had been a state representative in the 93rd House District. He got elected in the state Senate district that was caused by a vacancy when Paul Henry was elected to Congress in 1984. And so I thought, we could use this special election in 1985 in the 93rd House District to basically begin a lawsuit. And I sat down with Richard McClellan, who had recently kind of his firm kind of became part of Dykema Gossett, and laid out the scenario to him. And he said, yeah, I think if we file this lawsuit in the Western District of Michigan, much better to go to federal court than state court. They would be more sympathetic to a First Amendment argument.